Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker. Today's podcast episode is the first of 2 episodes on Russian threat doctrine. We'll use the recently published ATP 7-100.1, Russian Tactics, as the basis of our conversation. We welcome Mr. Jerry Leverich, the Senior Intelligence Analyst at the Training and Doctrine Command, TRADOC G2. We also welcome Mr. Flip Boyer, who also works at Fort Leavenworth and serves as a military analyst. We are happy to have Colonel Retired Rich Creed, Director here at CAD, join us again for today's episode. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Lisa. Good to be here.
Thanks, Colonel Becker.
Thank you, ma'am.
This is not our first visit to threat doctrine on the Breaking Doctrine podcast. Back in episode 24 and 25 of Breaking Doctrine, we focused on Chinese threat doctrine. More recently, we spoke with the TRADOC Commanding General and TRADOC G2 about the importance of understanding our threat doctrine. We're back today to talk Russian threat doctrine based on the recently published ATP 7-100.1. So we've touched on the 7-100 series before on the podcast, and we've talked about how threat doctrine used to be more focused on non-specific actors. So Mr. Creed, could you give listeners a recap of why we are now writing doctrine based on a specific threat?
Yeah, sure thing. So back in 2016, 2017, as we were working on the 2017 version of FM30 operations, the Combined Arms Center Commander, Lieutenant General Lundy, and us were discussing if we're going to focus on large-scale combat operations, conventional warfare again, per the Army Chief of Staff's guidance, we really needed to frame who we were fighting against. I mean, you have an operational concept, at the time it was Unified Land Operations, but you have a cultural focus on preparing the Army for large-scale conventional conflict, then obviously it raised the question, well, large-scale conventional conflict against who? And there were real concerns inside the Army at the time that we didn't want to get out in front of our skis in terms of, what the national leadership was willing to accept. In other words, people were pretty shy about naming names. And so as we were working through the book, we were looking for threat models, and TRADOC G2 was helping us with that. And then a couple interesting things happened. One, the Army Chief of Staff was testifying in Congress in open hearings and naming names, specifically naming Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran as adversaries who were potential threats who, there could be a possibility that we might have to engage in conventional warfare with them at some point. And that was a marked departure from the public testimony and really the way the Army was looking at military problems compared to the previous 25 years, where our threats were primarily in the CENTCOM AOR, insurgents, the Taliban, Iraqi insurgents, and so forth. So once that happened, we said, okay, and TRADOC G2 helped us come up with some threat models based on a distillation of the approaches that the Russians and Chinese primarily use, but informed by the other two adversaries as well. And then, so while we didn't name them specifically in the text of the doctrine, in the introduction of FM30 that was signed by the Combined Arms Center Commander, it did name those 4 adversaries specifically. And that set us free. Nobody blinked an eye about it. And so the next step was, okay, why don't we consider doing what we did in Cold War days, where we had threat doctrine on the Soviet Army and the larger Warsaw Pact that was codified as threat doctrine in the Army's doctrine library. So in our doctrine library, and we had that for some number of years. In fact, that threat doctrine informed how our OPFOR, or opposing forces, fought at the CTCs through the 1990s as well. So we had that. The other idea was and maybe justification for, coming up with this series of ATPs on threat doctrine was, while we had the decisive action training environment that captured what each of these adversaries could do, kind of the best in breed approach, we didn't have a product, a non-digital product, that framed specific adversaries so that, say, for example, you were rotating to Korea or you were rotating to Europe or the CENTCOM area of operations. Were deterrents to fail, how would those specific threats fight as opposed to a more generic model in the digital training database for simulations and so forth? So I think those two things, both the Army's focus on specific adversaries writ large from a readiness perspective, and then this ability to give or this desire to provide a product that units could use for home station training and leader development.
Mr. Leverich, how have you seen the threat doctrine evolve from that non-specific to more specific throughout your career?
So I was going to add, and I think Rich gave a great overview of that, but if we go back to the ascension of General Milley during that period to Chief of Staff of the Army and those confirmation hearings, also corresponds with the change in our national strategy. This was at the peak of, or at the beginning of great power competition. Our strategic documents actually laid out the 5 threats for us. So that national drive, based on our political leaders and then how it permeated through the Army down to a lot of those pieces that Mr. Creed just mentioned.
I want to move to recent conflict. So we draw a lot of lessons learned for our Army from the Ukraine-Russia conflict that's ongoing. Mr. Boyer, I'm going to send this over to you. Could you start off with how that conflict did or did not influence the writing of this ATP?
So I think it's important to know for this ATP that it predates the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, or at least the work on it predates the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the ATP should really be viewed more like a FM3-0 for how the OPFOR fights, how a Russian-focused OPFOR might fight. The lessons learned that Russia's learning the lessons learned that Russia is drawing from Ukraine, that the United States and its partners are drawing from Ukraine, and even other threat actors like China might be drawing from Ukraine. TRADOC G2 is doing a great deal to support that lessons learned process through our regular conflict running estimates that started as a capture of lessons learned from observations in Ukraine and has expanded across the operating environment. And then TRADOC G2 is also, aside from the running estimates, TRADOC G2 is publishing Red Diamond articles to inform intelligence analysts throughout the Army and inform exercise designers and planners that are capturing those lessons learned faster than we could incorporate them into a new doctrine. So although this doctrine was published, it's definitely not final and will be revised.
So it's a point of departure, right? And so they adapt during conflict, and obviously it takes a while to write a book. So I think the audience would probably use this ATP as this is a baseline from which you can draw conclusions from your observations of what's going on.
So if I could add into that, great points all. A couple of things I think that are worthy of consideration for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Number one, we lose sight sometimes that this is the largest thing that the Russians have done since World War II. So, with that type of scale, there's going to be a whole lot of learning of what large-scale combat looks like. I would argue that at the front end of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia actually tried to deviate from their doctrine and what they call their new generation warfare. In many cases, it didn't turn out very well for a myriad of many reasons, whether it's, familiarity, training, all those DOT-MIL PF things that support understanding of doctrine. But over time, as we watch this, and I think they have returned to doctrine in many ways, there's a number of trends and differences and adaptations that are ongoing constantly, and we capture those in our running estimates, which will set us up for subsequent updates to what we're seeing in this conflict, underpinned by the ATP. Some of the things that we're seeing that are different that the ATP doesn't necessarily capture very well is, the employment of UAVs, the extensive, the smaller unit organizations, the company size operations that the Russians have kind of reverted to as a result of the static nature of the battlefield. So those are some of the things that are, the inability to actually maneuver has impact on the application of their way to war right now. And we're capturing all those, and we put those out, of course, as part of a running estimate. Kind of consider our running estimate to be a bit of an addendum to the ATP.
Yeah, Jerry, so that triggered a couple thoughts. One is, all armies, ours included, doctrine says what we want to do, what we think we need to be able to do, or our preferences for the things that we do as we conduct operations. But when that comes up against reality, sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect between what you say you're going to do and what you're actually able to do. And it may be informed by a lot of things, right? The context of the conflict, the sizes of the forces involved, the objectives of the war, all of those things, I think, are variables that are hard to account for when you're trying to distill out some sort of doctrine that you could measure yourself against, right? And I think the other thing that gets into our heads, and it's a generational thing, right? You may flip. We're of a certain age that, we grew up, at least when we were initially commissioned in the Army, with thinking of the Russian or the Soviet threat as one thing. And so you get these stereotypes in your heads about, mass, the Russian bear, everything's about artillery and mass. When you look at this war, especially in the beginning, the troop levels of both forces in Ukraine are a fraction of what we're fighting in Ukraine in 1942 to 1945, right? So you don't have that relative mass. It's not that they're small armies. It's just that the manifestation of this conflict on the ground is not the same as the Second World War or even what we would have envisioned in the Cold War. Is that a correct assessment?
No, I think that's right on, Rich. And I think you really hit on a couple of points here. Doctrine is a baseline. FM30 would probably look a little bit different in Europe than it would in the Pacific. And like all armies with doctrine, it's the application of doctrine to the current situation where adaptability becomes so much more important. I think the other challenge that we see within Russia right now is, as this has become a prolonged conflict, the ability to actually train to a doctrinal standard with the full institutions has diminished. So, we get back closer to the basics, back to the drill, back to, the combat lessons learned that are that we're kind of seeing now, which speak to the evolution of large-scale combat operations.
Yeah, and I think there's the other piece to get to your point about learning. The old Red Army days, you wouldn't have a lot of public discussions about successes and failures, right, or criticisms of leaders and generalship or even the national political authorities. But I think you've got a pretty freewheeling and vocal amount of commentators on the Russian side that is pretty open.
Absolutely. And I would argue that, that's one of the great things that's a little bit different about the U.S. Army, but there's some similarities in here. And what I mean by that is, the Russians have done lessons learned. They know what some of their deficiencies were in the early part of this. But again, they are an army in contact, and the ability to inculcate and take on those lessons has been more, combat situation oriented, vice what we do, which is, bring out, call, get all these things captured and push them out to the force.
Yeah. One of the big fears that I have watching kind of the Z heist of this war with the Americans is we'll walk away thinking that Russians are an adaptive or learning organization. The bottom line is it just happens very differently than how we do it. So it is much like the way they run staffs, much more leader and almost personality centric, done by divisions. And then you've got these military commentators and patriotic organizations that are capturing lessons learned and putting out pamphlets that if you're a history nerd and you've read a Civil War soldier's camp best friend, you've got the DOSAF, the Russian kind of military booster club, putting out pamphlets for these guys to help them survive, help them deal. They cover everything from camouflage against drones to just maintaining breathing and what we would call master resiliency training under fire, identifying these gaps that Russia is seeing and learning. It just looks a lot more decentralized, and it looks like it's not happening because you're not seeing it across the entire breadth and depth of the Russian front. But it's there, and it will be centralized, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from that is it would be a very serious mistake to underestimate their ability to learn and their ability to adapt.
I think we're kind of getting at a cultural piece, and I'd like to talk kind of big picture of how Russia views the world and what their lens is for the strategic environment. So, Mr. Leverich, could you show us how Russia thinks about both us as the United States and their neighbors?
So absolutely. And if you go back to, again, our strategic documents, about 2018, where we started to characterize Russia as a revanchist power, and it's right on point when you consider even President Putin's, specific comments of, the fall of the wall was one of the greatest geopolitical mistakes or travesties of the 20th century. And you see it even within their conflict today early on, and what their negotiations for ceasefires all discuss, which is let's go back to. Their 2021 national security strategy, I think, really sets a tone for relations with the West and what they see in a post-Cold War era, their engagement with global leadership and what that looks like, a multipolar world, a new relationships with what we call the global South, their relationships with China's. Out of their 2021 document, they laid out four strategic objectives. Number one is their regional dominance. And you see this portrayed throughout. This is, Europe and parts of Central Asia and Asia. We used to call this area the near abroad. Think of it to be kind of the former area, the Soviet Union. Their ability to influence throughout those areas. Protection and security, their heavy reliance on the military as an element of national power. All armies or all nations kind of go through the dime construct. I would argue if you look at Russia, they tend to lean a little bit more heavily on the coercive military aspect as well as information than either China or the United States does. Countering foreign influence, and this speaks to security of the regime there. They tend to offer, they tend to have a mindset of paranoia and reactive and preemptive actions, and in recognition as a world power. And I think this is really important to them. Their international standing as a foil to what many might think as the injustices of the West or NATO and the international liberal system. Exploit and manipulate the information domain and environment, and the sophisticated application of soft power. So those are how they see themselves and how they see the world. And it does put up for the potential for conflict in a number of areas.
You talk the elements of national power, and so essentially what I'm kind of hearing is small D, diplomatic, big information, big military, and then smaller economic. Is that kind of what I'm hearing?
So that's great. And let me give you a comparison. If we're looking at China, it's probably big E, D, I, smaller M. They lead with the economic aspect, establish the relationships, garner their position, and then, driven by the economy and the Belt Road Initiative and things like that to gain access.
Yeah, I'd really like to hone in on the Russia having a big I. So we just published ADP 313 information, and, that's our first publication on information, but Russia thinks about information very differently. I think President Putin thinks about information very differently. So can you kind of talk about that and how they leverage the big I?
Oh, that's a great segue. And I would say that the big I in Russia is fairly sophisticated. It is founded in a deep historical context. Late 1990s, early 2010s, Russia actually published their information concept called information confrontation. And there's a number of pillars that support that and how they intend to operate in that information domain. Things like reflexive control, posturing to get a reaction or to quell a reaction as a concept out of the 80s with them that they still use. One thing that we kind of don't really address as well, I think, is things within the political domain. And, going back to the 1930s, Russia's ideas of political warfare and what they call active measures, which is, support for subversive groups, political intrigue, their sabotage, disinformation, misinformation, including violent actions, and then subversion to weaken the West or popular support, all within that coalesced information push under the elements of national power.
Hey, Jerry, but, so that's all strategic, maybe even high operational stuff. But, I mean, the Russians, and certainly the Soviets and the Red Army in the 20th century, they were real tactical manifestations during the conduct of military operations. I mean, the Soviet Army has a pretty rich history of executing very effective deception and information operations in support of tactical actions on the ground, no?
Oh, absolutely. And as simple as things with decoys being used in the current conflict, how we're seeing both sides actually work through. But the information sphere and how they shape the populations on the ground locally to either challenge will or to gain support or for tactical means, with technical measures on the tactical battlefield.
I'd just like to add, while we're talking about it, sometimes the tactical application of Maskirovka, right, or the fact that Maskirovka exists in the Russian context as such a big piece of their doctrine, will enable these higher level operational and strategic information operations.
Maybe you should explain to the audience what Maskirovka is if they're not familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Maskirovka is a blanket term that covers military deception, tactical and operational levels of psychological operations, everything from decoys to the use of feints to grouping apparent power and then striking from somewhere else, right? So Maskarovka goes hand in glove with Russian tactical and operational actions across kind of the whole spectrum of really land warfare. And if you were a Cold Warrior or you were a post-Cold War Russia watcher, you really grew up with that in your mind. It added a dimension of unpredictability as an analyst to what you might assess the Russians were doing. It was always an element of caution when assessing those course of action.
So again, deep history with the Russians, and Maskarov is a perfect example of that. You know, going all the way back to the 1940s, you know, a deep-seated doctrine to cover military deception. You know, and they're looking at things like concealment, intimidation, use of decoys, dummies, maneuvers intended to deceive, denial, disinformation. So, you know, a deep-seated, I would argue, information operations that they capture at the front end of their battlefield analysis. Unlike, you know, where sometimes we tend to think about it as an afterthought. And again, the historical aspects, you know, a number of battles, you know, during Stalingrad, the Battle of Kursk, where the Russians were able to conceal their intentions and their capabilities on the battlefield to achieve their aims.
Yeah, I think there's ever since this war got really hot again in Ukraine, as you watch some of the battles, it makes me think of some of those Second World War campaigns where the Russians focus on an area and their opponent is forced to respond.
You know, I would offer one of the more successful areas of Maskarova deception early on in this conflict, second year in this conflict, was the Ukrainian use of it to pull the Russians down south in the battlefield, which subsequently enabled the Ukrainian push up towards Kharkiv after the Russians had pulled out, anticipating a big attack from Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Gentlemen, it's been a really great conversation. I have absolutely learned a lot today. I want to talk about one last thing before we wrap this up. How do the forces use this?
Let you guys go first. You guys wrote the doctrine, so you tell me what you want people to take away from.
Oh, so look, I think going all the way to the start of our conversation on getting our Army oriented and understanding our adversaries, you know, General McConville and also General George, you know, have both made points of they want the Army to understand, you know, China and Russia in the way that we used to understand the Soviet Army. So I think those are really important aspects and where our nation is having us focus these days, understanding our adversaries, understanding the characteristics and the evolving aspects of large-scale combat operations, not just from our perspective, and Rich has laid out so much of that, but also how our adversaries are looking at this. Because while 20 years of counterinsurgency have provided a tremendous fundamental foundation for our Army on how we train, equip, and ultimately fight, I think LISCO and adversaries like Russia, like China, like North Korea, Iran, and even the enduring violent extremist organizations are going to present challenges that we haven't necessarily fought through in a long time. And then I think preparation will only help our Army.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, if I may, the ATP forms a good jumping off point to understand Russian doctrine, and recognizing that we can't update doctrine on a dime. That allows us to replicate or represent in training the Russian threat. It also works hand in glove with some of our other products, the running estimate that Mr. Leverich has mentioned, our LISCO challenges papers, our continuing Red Diamond publication, work with the Mad Scientist, work with Foreign Military Studies Office to create a holistic picture at the unclassified level to support training and understanding of the Russian threat as we go forward acknowledging them as our acute challenge, not just in Europe, but throughout the globe.
Yeah, I think those are both great points. I'll just throw out there from, doctrine programmatic perspective, and I'll just reference the podcast we did, episode 50, with General Brito, commander of U.S. Army Trading and Doctrine Command, a couple months ago. Chief of Staff of the Army, General George, he's got a priority, 4 big priorities. One of them is strengthening the profession. And our agreement, and we discussed it during the podcast, we've discussed it in other forums with Army senior leaders, is that it's our professional obligation to understand our potential enemies. And that should be a point of discussion in leader development programs. It should be something that's emphasized at home station in a continuous basis. Most of our formations in the U.S. Army are oriented on particular theaters, and you've got some that are more oriented into PACOM, AOR than Europe, some more Europe than other places. But if you've got an orientation on a particular theater and you know that your unit's rotating over there, as part of our active campaigning during competition, then we should be focused on understanding the adversaries in that theater. And I think these tools that TRADOC G2 have put together are, as Flip said, a perfect point of departure for that professional development.
Thanks, gentlemen. Join us on the next episode of Breaking Doctrine for more on our conversation about Russian threat doctrine. Just like writing new doctrine is a team effort, Breaking Doctrine takes a team. Without the crew and special doctrine division here at CAD, we wouldn't be able to bring you this show. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by 29 Pixels Studios. Please don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Audible, or Spotify podcasts, and follow us on social media at U.S. Army Doctrine to get updates on new podcasts, Doctrine Digest videos, and publications. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Lisa Becker, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.